What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Tonight, we're going to be taking a look at an apologist who's trying to fearmonger his audience, but he's got 3 questions that apparently atheists commonly ask, but we're only going to be covering one of them because the full video is like 22 minutes long. That's ridiculous for a Friday night stream, but we are going to cover one of them, and it's the one that the Skeptic Mafia selected for tonight. We're talking about whether or not God is omni-benevolent. And this is a topic that comes up, so it's not exactly a strong man to say that atheists bring up this common talking point or this question. Normally it's in response to some things, but also, it can be of some evidential value as far as pushing back against the Christian message. So tonight we're going to be discussing whether or not God is omni-benevolent. That nerdy fucking kid with, the magnifying glass on the ants in the sky. That guy. If you want to fuck around and find out why God is considered to be omni-benevolent, then please stay tuned. All right, welcome to the video. Tonight, we're going to be talking about why God is omnibenevolent according to the Bible. So the Bible claims that God is omnibenevolent, and this guy, this apologist, is going to try to fearmonger his audience into accepting that God still is omnibenevolent despite a bunch of shitty things happening in the world. A lot of unnecessary suffering happens. I feel like an omnibenevolent God only causes more questions than it really gives answers to. So I'm completely invested in this question of why they still consider God to be omnibenevolent. I've only heard lazy answers before. Commonly, the answers that I've heard has been like, oh, well, God is the basis of good. God can do no wrong, so therefore God never does wrong. And I don't understand that particular point of view there. So I'm always looking for good answers. He's got 2 others here that maybe we can go through some other time. So 2 other questions, like if God made everything, who made God? That's a very specific question for a very specific argument. And then why do we need God if evolution explains everything? That's just not something that atheists ask. And so now we're getting to the question of the night, and that is, why is God considered omnibenevolent? And they're going to use the Bible in order to prove that, which is kind of interesting. If they were to actually read the portions of the Bible that paint God as not omnibenevolent, I feel like they would change their mind, but let's see where they go with it.
Which is often the source of its strength. How can God be good if there is so much evil in the world? Of course, history certainly records many great evils. The Holocaust inflicted on the Jews.
Fueled by religion, specifically forms of Christianity.
The Soviet starvation of Ukrainians in the 1930s.
I mean, I don't know about that one, but God could have easily stepped in, snapped his fingers, and caused that not to happen. So, I mean, at that point, it's like if I sit here with my boneless wings and I'm watching a starving person that I could easily give a wing to, or I could easily share my food with, or I can make it so that that person's not hungry for whatever reason in any kind of way. And I don't do it, and I sit there and I watch that person starve and continue to starve to death. What does that say about me? Me just sitting there watching that person die. I feel like that says something really shitty about me. Now, obviously, I'm not talking about places that are seriously affected by starvation, because there is that one famous image of that vulture looking at that starving child, and that photographer actually felt so bad because he couldn't do anything for the child. He was advised by the people he was there with, or by the organization that he was there with, to not do anything to help anybody, that he can't do anything to help them. And so he had to watch, and that guy ended up killing himself later because he just couldn't handle it. I feel like that's the kind of toll that it should take on you. In this particular instance, the one that he's describing here, which I haven't looked up or anything like that, but the thing that he's describing here, God is just sitting back and watching it happen. Any normal person would have a problem with that. It would be psychologically damaging to them. God just seems to be perfectly fine with it. And he's like, oh shit, look, some bitch over there lost her keys. And he helps Lucy find her keys. So, there's that.
And chattel slavery in the pre-Civil War American South.
Primarily fueled by Christianity. Like that's what fueled it. Like they used Christianity in order to convince the slaves to stay slaves, like to justify the slavery. They even used the Bible in the formulation of the laws around slavery in the South. All All of this information is coming from Dr. Joshua Bowen, who wrote a book on slavery, and in his Atheist Guide to the New Testament, or Atheist Guide to the Old Testament, he has a section in there about the laws in the American South and how they were closely modeled off of the biblical laws. So definitely all of this is modeled off of the Bible. So I don't see how you could sit there and be like, how you can really argue your way around the Bible being a piece of shit book in this respect.
Are just a few examples. And for many of our viewers, the presence of evil in the world hits home in a personal way. Many of you have been robbed, assaulted, or abused. There is no getting around it. Our world is filled with evil. But if so, the atheist asks, how can God be good? After all, why would a good God allow such things? Is he too weak to stop it? Or is he just unaware that evil things happen? If so, then he isn't really God. And yet, if he's all-powerful and all-knowing, and yet he does nothing, then they claim he isn't good, and therefore isn't really God that way either.
Well, it's not that I say that he isn't God. I feel like that has an assumption that this entity still exists. We're admitting that this entity exists. It's just that it's not God. I have problems with that, the connotation of that. But what I do say is that either God can't be unaware of it, right? Because we're talking about the Christian God. So there's three properties that are in conflict: omnibenevolence, omniscience, and omnipresent. Those are the three that are in conflict here. If God is all-knowing, like he knows everything, then he definitely knows that the suffering is going on. If he can't figure out how to circumvent this suffering, then he's not all powerful. All three of these things are in conflict, because you can't say that God is all good if he, one, knows about suffering and chooses not to do anything with it. If he's not like choosing to do nothing with it, that he actually can't do anything with it, then he's not all powerful. So there are a lot of problems here. I feel like this is a good argument against the Christian God, because if the Christian God, if the requirement for the Christian God is to be all three of those properties, then that God doesn't exist. So it's not that, oh, this entity exists, he's just not God. It's not that. It's that it doesn't exist at all. This book describes a deity or a supernatural being that just simply can't exist. It's logically impossible for this being to exist with the way that we experience reality. That's what I would say. So I agree with the questions, basically, with the slight nuance to how they phrase that.
They claim this dilemma simply means there is no all-seeing, all-powerful, good God to begin with. So what do we make of this? Well, it's interesting how quick people are to put the blame on God for mankind's evil. And frankly, that is exactly what the devil would want us to do.
That's what the devil would want us to do. I can't take anybody seriously that honestly brings up the devil as like part of the explanation. Like, that's what the devil wants us to do. Also, did you notice the little subtitle there? It's when atheists attack. Like we attack people. I mean, we respond to people, sure, but it's normally because people say dumb shit in the first place. It's not that we're attacking anybody other than we're attacking the bad arguments. There are on occasion public people that do get attacked, but for the most part, for the general experience, people aren't being attacked. It's more of this persecution complex, you know?
It is interesting that when Adam and Eve first sinned by disobeying God and eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the first thing they both did was try to pass the buck.
Here's my problem with the whole eating the apple and doing wrong thing, right? If you read the story of Adam and Eve, which if you want to, you can go to the Daily Bible podcast down below. We go through the Adam and Eve story in the very first episode of the podcast. So if you want to go and check that out, please do. But if you think about the story, Adam and Eve are created by God, and then God just says, hey, there's a tree out here, don't eat the fruit from it. And they're like, okay, we won't. The thing is that they don't have the knowledge of good and evil. They don't know what's good and bad. They don't know that it's a bad thing not to obey God. God just expects them to know that it's a bad thing without being given the ability to know that it's a bad thing. So there again is another logical problem for Christianity and Judaism, the Abrahamic God in general. There's no way for Adam and Eve to know that it's good to obey God and bad to disobey God, but God punishes them anyways. God punishes them for disobeying God, for disobeying himself. I just don't see that as being rational. Like, that seems like an irrational thing to do. And I've never understood it, like, as far as me being an atheist. When I was a Christian, I just listened and believed. I'm the first one to tell you I was a gullible fuck. You told me that Adam and Eve were the source of all people on this earth. I was like, okay, cool. Well, that answers that question, I guess. Like, where did everybody come from? How did humans develop? Like, that's it. Guys, I remember as a kid, I wrote down in like a little journal thing that I tried writing one time, and I'm like, if Adam and Eve are really the source of all humanity, then that means that we're all cousins. And like, my gullible, indoctrinated brain was like, that's perfectly fine. I didn't understand anything about population genetics or genetics in general or anything of that sort. So Olivia says God is the parent who left the poison in the kiddie park and blamed the child for eating it. Yep, exactly. That's exactly what God did. He put the poison in the middle of the kiddie park. He put the red button there, told people not to push it, but didn't tell them, I guess didn't give them the knowledge of it, or they just simply didn't have the knowledge to not push it. Like, they were just told it. They didn't actually understand it. I feel like this is more of an informed consent kind of situation there. Now, the more that I think about it, it's like, oh, you just told somebody something, but they didn't completely understand it. So there's no way that they could consent to that particular paradigm or like that particular rule. Like, it's not like they could consent to actually understanding what God was talking about. If somebody doesn't understand something like that, how can you really blame them because they didn't understand?
After God asked them about it, we read their responses in Genesis 3. Then the man said, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me of the tree, and I ate." And the Lord God said to the woman, "What is this you have done?" The woman said, "The serpent deceived me, and I ate."
So yeah, he's talking about how our inclination is to pass the buck off to somebody else, to not take responsibility for our actions. I feel like this is all propagandistic shit that's in the Bible. Like, this is propagandistic. It's painting the human race in a certain light, saying that everybody has these baser needs of deceit and not taking responsibility for ourselves. And he's broad brushing with the entire human race with that idea. And that's just, it's never a good idea to broad brush an entire species, let alone a single demographic of people.
So Adam blamed Eve, and Eve blamed the devil. In fact, if you look more closely...
before he continues with the more closely bit, it's not actually the devil, it's just the serpent. It's some kind of evil force. The Bible never actually names the serpent as the devil. And, I know that later on people kind of identified the serpent with Satan or the devil. The Bible doesn't ever actually, in Genesis, say that that's the devil. It's just sort of like evil incarnate or something like that, which you could make, an argument that is the devil, evil incarnate, but that's just simply not the way that the Jews understood it, for one, the Israelites, the Jews, and that's also a much later development. It's anachronistic to call the serpent the devil.
Adam blamed God. Note he said, "The woman whom you gave to be with me." And to this day, people continue to blame God for the evil mankind is responsible for.
There are very specific things that I blame God for as far as evil goes. Because the Bible says that God knits us in the womb, like God knows us before we're born. Some people make that argument. In that respect, God is responsible for genetic diseases, which is one of these cases of unnecessary suffering in the world that happen on a methodological, naturalistic perspective. It's because of the flawed nature of biological organisms in general, like the way that our cells replicate replicate the way that we procreate, it's prone to errors. And that's one of the errors that happens. So I hate to say it, but it's kind of a shit happens sort of situation. Because it's a natural process, it's not perfect, and therefore imperfect shit happens, which would be the genetic diseases. That would be one thing. And then you have these certain things called the acts of God. And that would pretty much just be like natural disasters, right? Because these are things that are not necessarily caused by humans. You can make some arguments for certain things being humans, like how dangerous the hurricanes are getting now because we have changed the climate. And because we've changed the climate, that means that the hurricanes and the tornadoes and everything like that are more frequent and they're more powerful. So in that way, we have affected the environment that fucks us up. These are still considered acts of God, right? These are acts of nature. These are natural things that happen. You can make a cogent argument that God's responsible for that because it was thought at one time that God controls the weather. I don't know if y'all remember, but not so long ago, you had politicians right here in the United States of America that were claiming that things like autism and hurricanes and tornadoes, even mass shootings are these judgments levied on us by God. So even if you go into the Old Testament of the Bible, you see God exacting judgment on not only his people, but other people as well in the area that the Israelites were in. So, I mean, there are certain things that God is directly responsible for. Does that mean that I think God is responsible for Jimmy robbing a store and killing the clerk? No, I don't think that God is necessarily responsible for that. But what I do fault God for is those types of things occurring. And since he's all-knowing and all-powerful, he knows how to stop that without intervening with free will and all this other stuff. He can stop it, he can circumvent it, and he chooses not to. That says something about him, if he exists. If you're really tied to this whole idea of omnibenevolence, then God allowing that to happen isn't God like necessarily being the reason why it happened, but it does make him responsible for it happening in general. The fact that it was allowed to happen is God's fault in that particular sense. Now, do I think that that's a representation of reality? Like, is God really doing this? No, because I don't think God exists. But under the idea of this tri-omni God, under this idea of a tri-omni God, it just doesn't make logical sense. Like, there's no way this tri-omni God can be a tri-omni God if these things happen.
Consider the evils we mentioned earlier, the Holocaust, the cruelty of the Soviets, and slavery.
What about, hold on. So he said chattel slavery in the United States. What about chattel slavery in the Bible? I think that's a better thing to question right there, especially considering that God is directly responsible for the Israelites taking chattel slaves in the Bible. Why does this guy have to focus on shit that's outside of the Bible? Why can't he put up three things right there that are representative of things that God has directly commanded in the Old Testament, the source of all these problems? Because chattel slavery in the Old Testament, that's allowed by God. What about sexual slavery? Numbers 31 has clear-cut chattel or sexual slavery in it. And then at any point in the Bible where you have a girl being sold off to some creepy-ass fucking dude, that is also considered sexual slavery. How about you handle those two things? What about up there at the top? How about killing countless Israelites just because they allowed other religions to practice in Israel and all this other shit? Like, there's so many things that you could put here that are directly related to the Bible. It kind of makes it seem like he's not honestly interacting with this topic so that he can paint a certain narrative, a narrative that is, I guess, set in a modern sense. In these particular ways, I mean, they are concerned with the Bible, but at the same time, they are less concerned with the Bible and what it says and the definition of God than the things that I listed. It would be more honest for him to go over the various things directly in the Bible that are directly commanded by God and try to explain them. But he doesn't, because that would be an uncomfortable situation. Then you get into the Mike Winger, William Lane Craig situations where you say that, oh, it's a good thing that young children were killed by the sword because then they went to heaven and instead of living in a pagan society and eventually burning in hell. It's a good thing that they were killed. That's what both of them fuckers say.
Or for that matter, robberies, assaults, or abuses. Those are evil actions inflicted by human beings, and the blame for them should lie with those human beings.
So just a quick aside, it should definitely rely on those human beings. If you're going to sit there and say that there's this triomni God, then he would be ultimately responsible for those things happening. Not that he caused them to happen, but he is responsible for allowing them to happen.
Still, the question remains, why does God allow such human beings to commit evil? Part of that answer is founded upon the need for humans to have free will, which must include the ability to choose to do the wrong thing. God's purpose for us requires growing in character, specifically learning to possess God's own character.
Don't tell me about God's fucking character. Every single person that he has shown is more moral than Yahweh is. You know how I know? Well, I guess I can't really know these people. They could be fucking serial killers. Who fucking knows? What I do know is that I am definitely more moral than his God, because I would never and could never order people to slaughter innocent, defenseless children, babies, women. God does that in the Bible several times in the Old Testament. Don't fucking tell me about God's goddamn character, okay? Because you don't want to go there. God's character is shit. God's character is not above reproach. He does heinous shit in the Old Testament, things that we would consider to be war crimes now. But he's like, but we have to work ourselves up to being as good as God's character. The fuck are you talking about? Unless you're some kind of like psychopath, maniac, you're going to be more moral than God. The people that try to take on God's character, they're fucking fascist dictators.
To choose the right over the wrong. And growing in character requires the ability to make choices, free will choices, which includes the possibility of choosing evil and causing suffering, along with the possibility of choosing the good and to endure suffering.
Y'all think God suffers? If God exists, do you think that he's suffering at any particular point up there in heaven? Like, God doesn't suffer up there in heaven. I mean, in the Bible, God talks about suffering, but I mean, it's a lot like a child in the middle of a supermarket who's throwing a holy hell tantrum and like going boneless on the floor, kicking his legs to where they do that thing where they spin around in a circle, all because you won't buy him a fucking toy. That's essentially the character and the demeanor of God in the Old Testament, okay? Because God in the Old Testament, he will go on drunken rampages where he punishes the Israelites for simply allowing other people to worship other gods in Israel. God gets upset when the Israelites don't only worship him, they also worship other gods. And so it's really weird to me to hear this from a Christian, because it shows that this Christian is one of two things. He's either too incompetent to read his book, or he's lying. I'm more than happy to throw in a third option here. I mean, you could say that he doesn't consider those things to be bad because God did them, so therefore they're good. Well, I mean, I feel like that's really just shooting yourself in the foot there, because then you're describing your own self as being this horrible fucking monster who thinks it's good to like stab children in the chest. As long as they're in a different religion and a different culture, they're worshiping pagan shit, as long as they're doing that, you can kill a child fine, according to that particular kind of logic. So I really don't think that Christian apologists really want to go there, because then you have to end up saying some horrible shit like it's a good thing that kids are killed. He's either lying or he's incompetent. I feel like those are the two situations there.
When you understand the purpose of God, you come to understand that the eternal good that God is producing through his plan of developing his own righteous character in human beings is of such reality-altering significance that it will outweigh all the evil mankind has ever committed or experienced. In fact, the Apostle Paul says just that in Romans chapter 8 and verse 18. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. For the earnest expectation of the creation eagerly waits for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope. Because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God.
So I kind of feel like at this point he's trying to suggest that there is evil in this world. God knows about it and God is allowing it to happen, but that's okay. It's a good thing because like everybody's going to be saved later. Like everybody that should be saved or will be saved, they are going to be saved later. And so like it's fine that all this bad shit's happening because this is the depravity of man. And God doesn't really care about the things that happen maybe because there's going to be this new earth, there's going to be this salvation and everything like that. Like God's going to bring all of it home. And so that makes it okay, I guess. We'll let him continue, but I mean, this just goes to show that I feel like the root of this is the afterlife. They are so hell-bent on the afterlife that they're willing to forego shit that's happening in the one life that we know that we have for the hope of the afterlife. And so they're totally willing to just disregard whatever happens to them in this life because they got this afterlife waiting for them. And I feel like that really devalues this life. And I'm not in the business of devaluing this life. I am very much in value this life that we have because, like I said, it's the only life that we know that we have. So why not cherish it, enjoy it, and try to make the world a better place for, you know, our children or future people? Like, why not do things for us now to make the world a better place now? Why wait until we die? I just will never understand that.
Notice the current sufferings we experience aren't even worthy to be compared to the glory to come.
Let me get this straight. His answer for it is that the sufferings that occur now are so small in comparison to the afterlife that you just don't even need to worry about it. Israelites, stab a small child in the heart. No need to worry about it. Republicans pass anti-abortion laws and cause maternity deaths to go up, to skyrocket, to be twice as high as they've been in the past few years. No, don't worry about it because they went to heaven or some shit like that because, you know, they didn't get an abortion and they died because of the pregnancy. So they went to heaven because, you know, that's how God works. Yay. And it's really insignificant compared to God. Yay. I feel like that's bullshit. And I'm not happy with that answer. Like, I'm not happy with you just got to grit your teeth and bear it because we're all going to a field where we'll frolic and we'll get to spend all day in the sun and playing with our friends and seeing our family. Like, that's a nice idea, I guess, to do that for eternity if that were what the Bible describes as heaven. That's a total fantasy. The Bible does not describe heaven in that way. Heaven is just 24/7 praising Jesus and God, rather. I don't care how big God's glory is. God's fucking 15-foot glory in the sky does not trump the suffering that we are going through in reality.
In fact, notice too that Paul says that creation itself is suffering and will be delivered in that day to come. One of the curses of mankind's sin in the Garden of Eden was that we removed God as the caretaker of creation, as if we can do it all ourselves without him. God explains to Adam in Genesis 3, verses 17 through 19, that creation will no longer be accommodating to man in any special way, but will go its own course.
I'm sorry. This totally ignores the history of the planet. It's not that God has made the earth unfavorable to human life. That's how it always was. The planet Earth is unfavorable to most all life because all life that has existed on this planet at one point up until this point has died. It's just amazing to me that they're like, oh, everything was fine in the Garden of Eden, which if you actually read your Bible, it's in like 2 Corinthians or something or another. It actually says that the Garden of Eden is in the third heaven. That's what Paul believed. That's what early Jews believed, that the third heaven is where Eden exists. Adam and Eve were cast out of the third heaven to the earth. So even on biblical cosmology, what you have is the earth always being hostile to life. It's only in the heavens is it perfect. And if you don't believe me, you check it out. It's being called up to the third heaven. Hold on. It's 2 Corinthians 12, 2 through 4. It says, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven, third heaven, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. 2 Corinthians 12, 2 through 4. So this is Paul saying that Eden or paradise is in the third heaven. That's where Adam and Eve originally were. And so there's no way that it can be said that God changed the earth. God didn't change the earth. The earth has always been the way that it's been. It's just that God cast them out of heaven. Never mind all that. This guy's a creationist. So obviously he thinks that physics and the earth fundamentally changed after a woman ate a fruit. And he thinks that this is a rational explanation.
Mankind needs to learn the full lesson that we need God.
We don't need God at all. And I'm talking from a strictly analytical point of view here. We don't need God because there's nothing in this world that exists where we need God as an explanation. And I dare you to try me on this, because at every single point, any topic that you can bring up, any subject that you can bring up, I can guarantee you, I can give you a natural explanation for it, or I could just tell you that we don't know yet. But that doesn't automatically mean that God did it. God is not the default, the de facto explanation. I can give you the natural explanation for it, or I can tell you that we just simply don't know yet. It's unexplained, but that doesn't mean that God did it.
And that attempting to build a world without him leads only to suffering.
This isn't exactly true. If you take a look at societies now that are pretty irreligious, like you got Norway, Sweden, a bunch of other countries that are built off of more secularist ideas and humanistic ideas, you'll find that they are they are faring a lot better than some of the most religious countries out there. So this is in fact false.
As we are then left vulnerable to the afflictions of nature, our own evils, and the twistings and persecutions of the devil.
For him to say that without God we're left to the afflictions of nature is just totally ignorant of how many times per day people pray to God for some natural thing to be averted. And does that natural thing ever be averted? I mean, sometimes, but I mean, I think that it's not because of the prayer. I think that it's just because shit happens. And the same could be said for when a natural event isn't averted. Natural shit just happens. Like it's just, it's not necessarily coincidence. There are explanations for why certain things happen and why certain things don't. But as far as like this transcendental, why did this happen? Shit just happens. No amount of prayer is going to change that. Commonly, whenever this gets brought up, I like to say, shit in one hand, pray in the other. Which one fills up faster? I guarantee you it's the shit one.
If you're a parent, you understand what God is doing if you think about it. How many times must parents allow a child to experience a taste of the results of their own bad choices before they know the lesson will sink in?
I definitely think as a parent, in a very controlled way, allowing your children to experience the consequences of their decisions, I think that's a very big life lesson for them to learn. I think that they should understand that, definitely. And how many times should you do it? At some point, they're either going to understand it, but be fine with suffering the consequences, or maybe they just won't ever learn. I mean, I don't know. I don't understand how this relates to God other than this whole parental figure thing. Maybe he'll explain. I doubt it though.
Well, in God's case, he's not just teaching one child, but literally all of humanity. And the lessons need to make an impact for eternity.
So you're trying to tell me that there's no way for God to teach these lessons that don't include allowing the suffering to happen? Because this this is a bit of a false analogy here, because like the parent is not going to allow the child to, like, for instance, handle massive amounts of plutonium and get cancer and die, whereas God would. Well, I mean, I don't think God exists, so I don't think God does anything. But on this particular view, God is the parent that would allow the child to do something that would cause them to die. God would allow the child to do something enough times to where they would put their lives in danger and die. Or God would put them through some kind of suffering that's really not a lesson for anything. How do you pass off like genetic diseases as like a lesson for something, like some kind of suffering? Like, it's not like a bad decision that a kid is made to get bone cancer or to have some other kind of genetic disease. It's not like they made a decision that they need to be taught about. Those are just fucking shit that happens. This entire analogy here is shit. I don't know why he's making it, other than he's just not actually thinking about the argument that he's making. He's just like, oh, this sounds good. Fuck, throw that in there. Put a nice little watch graphic over it and shit. People will eat that up.
The stakes of these lessons could not possibly be higher. Yet we have God's promise that at the time of restoration of all things, the glory that is revealed in the children of God will far outshine any evil that has ever been committed and any suffering that has ever been experienced.
I feel like you could rephrase this and say, listen, heaven is better than God sitting there watching a woman get raped in an alley, because that's what one of the little clips that he put in there was a guy following a woman down an alley. Obviously, that's they're either gonna assault them and take their stuff, or they're gonna grape them or whatever in the fuck. To sit there and be like, oh, heaven is gonna be better than anything that you could suffer here in this life. So these are really just minuscule things. You just gotta focus on going to heaven. And like that totally ignores like the effects that suffering has on this life, and I feel like it can make you just sort of put it out of sight, out of mind that people are suffering, and that there are things that we can do to reduce that suffering, or in some instances prevent suffering. But you don't have people like this really appealing to anything that happens in this life. All they're sitting there thinking about is, oh, it's going to be great when we can frolic around in the fields in heaven. This is like so fucked up.
Such that they will not even come to mind anymore forever.
Well, yeah, because you're not supposed to think about anything other than praising Jesus' dick when you're up there in heaven. That's supposed to be on your mind 24/7, just praising his dick. That's all you're supposed to do in heaven. So yeah, you're not going to be thinking about all the suffering that you had here on earth, because you're going to be a totally different fucking individual.
We should all pray that time comes quickly. So to summarize an answer to this third attack.
No. I do not. I like how it's third attack. It's not just like a question that we have about their bullshit theology. It's this attack. It's an attack on Christianity. That's disingenuous. I like how he said, oh, we should all pray for this to happen soon. No. I don't pray for death. I don't pray for this afterlife or this coming glory. I don't pray for that, because then that means that I'm dead. I don't pray for my own death, or I don't wish, in translating it to my own personal position, I don't wish for death on a daily basis. Maybe that's just a fundamental difference between me and this dipshit here, is that I don't wish for that on a daily basis. I treasure my life. I feel like if you're sitting there praying and wishing for the heaven, it kind of seems like you don't value what's going on here. This entire video has been him not valuing what's going on in our lives now, and instead grasping for what he thinks is waiting for him after he dies. I've got too much shit going on in my life to focus on death. I'm more focused on the here and now and what good I can do with my life, and how positive of an effect I can have on people around me, on my community, just on everybody. I'm too focused on that to care about the whole death thing. I care about preventing death. If you know, that's what I would say. I care enough to try to prevent my own death. I do the things that I need to do to stave off death as long as I can. But it kind of seemed like he gave the advice that you should wish for death or pray for heaven to come or pray for all of us to go to heaven quicker. Like, I know what he's saying, and I know that it's not like he's consciously being like, oh, I wish I would die today. I so wish that God would just take me up and kill me right now. Like, I get that he's not thinking of it that way. But when I hear that and I think about the ramifications of what it means to hope for heaven to come quicker, I think, well, what does that mean? Well, that means that I'm going to die. I'm going to die and I guess go to heaven. Well, that means that I'm hoping for a quicker death. I'm hoping for this life to end sooner than it is already going to end for me. I'm not doing that. And I think it's ridiculous for somebody to present it like that.
Evil in the world is a consequence of man's free will.
Evil is a subject. Well, evil, good, bad, those kinds of things, those are all subjective. It really depends on your point, like on your own personal opinion as to what is evil and what is bad and what is good. Everybody has their own moral foundation with which to judge these actions or these situations with. That's really a subjective thing. And it's not a consequence of man's free will. It's just a consequence of sentient beings. It's a consequence of having a moral foundation, being able to identify evils in the world.
Yet God is using our choices to achieve an eternal good that will far outweigh any suffering mankind has ever experienced.
I don't think, like, even if heaven does exist, which we don't know that it does, if heaven does exist and it's an eternity afterwards, and you want to be in heaven, you want to be up there praising God all the time, then I feel like that does, in fact, reduce the value of this life to you, because this life is just preventing you from being in heaven that much longer, which, I mean, you could arguably say that because heaven is eternal, the amount of time between now and when I die and then getting to eternity, that time frame is essentially nil as well. But at the same time, it's like the value of this life is also reduced to nil because, you know, it's just preventing you from going to heaven. Whereas from my own perspective is I don't know what happens after this life, and I don't think that there's any way that we can know what happens after this life. But what I do know is that I have this life now, and I want to make the best of it. I want to do everything that I can, that I want to do, that's within reason. That's just where I stand on it.
The fact is, we are living in an increasingly skeptical world in which God is being effectively shoved into a corner as the movers and shakers of society seek to create a civilization that pretends he does not exist.
What the fuck? Like, that is not what's going on. The United States, where this fucker probably lives, is not being molded into a society that pretends that God doesn't exist. I mean, we've got "In God We Trust" on our money. I mean, we've got acknowledgments of God all throughout our society. Here in Alabama, I could throw a rock and it could hit a church, ricochet, hit another church, ricochet, and hit a priest in the head. So, I mean, don't sit there and try to act like the United States is some kind of godless nation now, or that we're working to remove God from society. That's not what is happening. This is just fear-mongering bullshit being peddled by this guy. And it's just so ridiculous to hear, because anybody with a rational thought in their head would be able to recognize that most of the politicians that are elected to our government are religious, are Christian, a majority Christian. They're Christian. God's not being erased. Christians are still the majority here in America for now. The nuns are growing, the Muslim demographic's growing, but Christians are still on top. Y'all are losing numbers fast. Y'all are bleeding them pretty quick. I mean, y'all are still top dog out there. Y'all got the biggest 15-foot penis, okay? I was really unimpressed with this guy's video, obviously. I don't really take kindly to being fear-mongered, which is exactly what this guy was doing. I don't like it at all. That's the apologist's, broken record. That's what they always do. They always fear-monger. One thing that did surprise me was his advice to wish for heaven to come sooner, which I translate into wish for death to come sooner, or something like that. That's kind of surprising to me. It's also surprising to know that he considers the suffering in this world to be so minuscule in comparison to the heaven that exists afterwards, to the glory of God. And I feel like at that point, someone's bullshitting you. You know that someone is trying to convince you that a bowl of shit is actually chocolate ice cream. I don't care if you put fruity sprinkles on top of the shit, it's not going to turn it into chocolate ice cream. Okay, it's still a bowl of shit. It was enlightening to how this particular guy sees the world and everything like that. If you will, please let me know what you thought about his video down below in the comments or in the side chat right now. I'd really appreciate it. But while you're down there leaving me a comment, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of video. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.